Video game length is one of the most hotly debated aspects of the medium these days, with players considering the value of short cinematic campaigns compared to AAA open-world experiences crammed with time-wasting collectathon content. While some might argue that no bad game is short enough and no great game is too long, there are definitely excellent video games that outstay their welcome by at least a few hours. With developers worried about reviews complaining their game isn't long enough, there's a tendency for them to over-egg the pudding rather than risk delivering a product that's just not worth a full retail price. I'm Jess from WhatCulture, and here are 10 video games that were too damn long, commenter edition. Number 10. Uncharted 4: A Thief's End. Uncharted 4 was at the time the peak of Naughty Dog's powers as innovators of slickly cinematic gameplay. There's a fair argument to be made that the 3 prior entries into the franchise also all outstayed their welcome by an hour or two, but the finale to Nathan Drake's story takes this to frankly exhausting extremes. As gorgeously and brilliantly crafted as the game is, fatigue begins to set in roughly 2/3 of the way through the near 15-hour campaign, when it's clear that Naughty Dog has more or less run out of fresh ideas to keep the gameplay exciting. The formula of exploring an area, platforming around, and engaging in an inevitably prolonged firefight becomes wearisome long before the end, and by cutting down some of the more snoozy platforming segments, the game could have clocked in at a more palatable 10 to 12 hours. Naughty Dog clearly heard the complaints loud and clear though, as the Lost Legacy spin-off, which was fantastic, was a spry lean 6 hours, and all the better for it. Number 9. Resident Evil 6. Though the earlier Resident Evil games were all incredibly short, Resident Evil 4 began the series' trend of longer and more ambitious campaigns, culminating in the excessive slog that was Resi 6. With 4 interwoven mini-campaigns lasting 4 to 5 hours each, getting to the end credits could easily take up to 20 hours, by which point most players were surely happy to see the end of it. The extended playtime, of course, wouldn't be so bothersome if people actually loved what Capcom was doing here, but Resident Evil 6 is by far the most divisive major entry into the series, with its unbalanced focus on action over survival horror. Across 20 hours, the high-octane set pieces become incredibly numbing, with little in the way of sufficient innovation to keep it interesting. At half the length, Resi 6 still would have been a mediocre entry into the franchise, but at least a lot less ennui-inducing. Number 8. The Last Guardian. The Last Guardian is a wonderful, if deeply flawed game, which spends most of its playtime bonding the player with their bird-mammal companion creature, Trico. And while that bond benefits from the game's length to an extent, it's also fair to say that the surprisingly long 12 to 14 hours it takes to beat the game forces it to outstay its welcome. A big part of the problem is Trico's frustrating AI, which, while at least somewhat intentional in order to imitate the behaviors of a real animal, becomes positively maddening over so many hours. Given that Team Ico's previous game Shadow of the Colossus crammed 16 bosses into a mere 8-hour game without feeling rushed, there wasn't much reason for The Last Guardian to get dangerously close to double that length. Considering the divisive nature of the gameplay, brevity would have absolutely been the soul of wit here. Number 7. Octopath Traveler. Octopath Traveler is a gorgeous RPG, albeit one you couldn't really be blamed for never even starting, considering that the main story unfolds over a beefy 50 to 60 hours. Despite its gorgeous visuals and inspired combat system, there are 2 key issues which accentuate the game's brutal playtime. For starters, many of the 8 focal stories are actually pretty uninteresting and pore over similar ideas, ensuring the game feels woefully padded. In addition to the story bloat, battles, especially boss fights, have a tendency to drag on interminably, resulting in a game that feels egregiously long-winded and self-indulgent. Look, nobody goes into a JRPG expecting a short game, but Square Enix took the genre's expansive canvas to self-parodying extremes here, and yet it's somehow not the longest game on this list. Not by a long shot. Number 6. Death Stranding. Hideo Kojima's Death Stranding is one of the most singular video game experiences of the last decade, a mesmerizing reinvention of the modern action game, focused less on combat than on traversing an ultra-treacherous post-apocalyptic landscape. Kojima has never been a concise storyteller, so it's not terribly surprising that his latest project is such a long game. But even so, did anyone expect the Critical Path to run a full 30 hours on its own? Just the Critical Path. Beyond even the fact that the game's final cutscene is literally longer than most movies, it's a game that encourages players to stop and smell the roses across its 70 story missions. And per its sometimes frustrating traversal mechanics, doesn't allow players to get anywhere fast. As relaxing an experience as it can be, Kojima could have definitely said everything he needed to say in 10 hours or less, and made a large chunk of mandatory story missions optional side quests for the most dedicated of players to tackle. Number 5. Doom Eternal. As much as 2016's Doom reboot was a hugely pleasant surprise, many players nevertheless felt that its 12-hour campaign was a couple of hours too long, with repetition well and truly setting in by the end. Rather than listen to that criticism though, id Software largely doubled down for last year's sequel Doom Eternal, with an expanded single-player mode that clocked in at a few hours longer. By the time it's over and you've slogged through all those elongated arena battles and slain every annoying last marauder, it feels more like a tiresome endurance trial than a face-melting power fantasy, as awesome as the central combat might be. You can't fault the ambition on offer with its more diverse array of environments, but between the clunky platforming, that irritating underwater section, and the overall sense of sameness which creeps into many of the battles, it's ultimately a game that would have benefited from some trimming. For many fans, more Doom can never be a bad thing, but if you're a casual player who would be happy with an 8 to 10 hour Blastathon campaign, this definitely feels tiresome and overbaked by the end. Number 4. Final Fantasy VII Remake. After years and years of waiting, Final Fantasy VII Remake was finally released last year to considerable acclaim, largely delivering the goods and expanding the opening portion of Square Enix's legendary RPG. But Final Fantasy VII Remake is also one of the most shamelessly bloated AAA games in recent memory. An excellent 20-hour game encased within a woefully padded 30-hour critical path. For all of the brilliant ways Square Enix fleshed out the original game, the remake is also padded out with tedious dungeons, most egregiously Hobo's Lab late in the game, boring switch-throwing exercises, prolonged gap squeeze animations which, in fairness, disguise load times, and that horrendous crane puzzle. You know the one. Despite 20 hours being more than long enough for the main story, especially with the wealth of side content on offer, Square needlessly filled out roughly 1/3 of the critical path playtime with boring repetition. When you consider that this remake project is gonna be at least 3 games, the entire compendium is looking to be around 100 hours long, and that's for players who don't stop and smell the roses. Number 3. Immortals FENYX Rising. Immortals FENYX Rising was one of 2020's most pleasantly surprising games, a Ubisoft bloatfest collectathon game that also boasted fun combat and neat puzzles. It's just a shame it went on and on and on for a soul-draining 25 hours, long after your average player was ready to move on. This is par for the course for a lot of UB games in throwing so many things to do at the player that it's impossible to get through their games in a pacey manner. Beyond flooding the map with icons though, Immortals' repetitive boss-felling loop makes the padding feel especially blatant, as enjoyable as the core gameplay might be. By the time you've made it to the end, you couldn't be blamed for wishing it was a svelte 12 hours instead, because Immortals simply doesn't have enough gameplay variety on offer to sustain dozens of hours. Number 2. Persona 5. If you're thinking of starting Persona 5, one of my favorite games of all time, it's worth knowing from the outset that Atlus's all-timer RPG is the slog to end all slogs as the genre goes. Even on the lower end, you're gonna need to commit 80 hours to the course, and players not rushing are more likely to end up with 100 hours on the clock. I think I came in at around 120, 130. Persona 5, for everything it does so well, is a game that has little regard or respect for the player's time. You're locked in and you're gonna enjoy it. Sections like Okamura's Palace are torturously overlong, distending the game out to such lengths that players not sufficiently invested in the story or characters are highly likely to bounce off eventually. Literally a few dozen hours of the game could be straight up lost without compromising the entertainment value on offer. There are obviously many hardcore Persona fans out there, like me, who lick their lips at the prospect of a 100-hour game, but fair enough for the average player with limited free time and a desire to, play other games. It is a colossal, unreasonable ask. And that's not including the Persona fans like me who will tell you have to play Royal even if you've already played through Persona 5. Number 1. The Last of Us Part 2. The Last of Us Part 2 is one of the greatest games of the decade, and to the surprise of just about everyone, ended up clocking in at well over 20 hours. That's basically double the original. While Naughty Dog are to be commended for their first-rate combat and the game's bold narrative detours, even its ambitious character-hopping story doesn't justify such a lengthy experience. Some might argue that the game's excess length makes players feel like they're truly on the grueling journey with its characters, but ultimately, it's easy to feel like the game could have wrapped up at least 2 or 3 hours earlier and said everything it still had to say. Given the extremely downbeat nature of The Last of Us Part 2, spending almost an entire earthly day reaching the end makes for a genuinely draining experience, even if you spread play out over a week or so. Needless to say, if Naughty Dog does press on with the third game, they'd be foolish to double the playtime once again. Sometimes, restraint is a good thing. And that's it for our list based on your comments. Do let us know down in that comment box if we've still missed some video games you reckon were way too damn long. As always, I've been Jess from WhatCulture. Thank you so much for hanging out with me. If you like, you can come say hi to me on my Twitter where I'm at Jess McDonald, but make sure you stay tuned to us here for plenty more great content.